Charles Bronson sits alone at the studio commissary after being brutally rejected for another leading role when the casting director announces loudly, "Face it, Bronson. You'll never be leading man material. Your character actor stock, nothing more." That's when Paul Newman walks over from across the room, puts his hand on Charles's shoulder, and says something that shocks everyone within earshot and changes Charles's entire perspective on what it means to be a star. Los Angeles, California, April 1967. Wednesday afternoon, 1:30 p.m. The MGM Studios commissary, where dreams are discussed over coffee and careers are dissected between bites of overpriced sandwiches. The lunch crowd buzzes with industry gossip, script discussions, and the particular energy of people whose livelihoods depend on other people's opinions of their faces. Charles Bronson sits at a corner table, staring at a cup of coffee that's gone cold while he processes what just happened in the casting office upstairs. Another rejection. Another not quite right for the part. Another reminder that at 46 years old, after 17 years of grinding through supporting roles, Hollywood still sees him as the villain, the heavy, the character actor who dies in the second act. This morning's audition was for the lead in Cool Hand Luke, a prison drama that could have been perfect for him. A character who understands hardship, survival, the weight of institutional oppression. Charles prepared for weeks, studied every line, understood every motivation. He walked into that casting room, knowing he could bring authenticity to the role that pretty boy actors couldn't fake. Instead he got the speech. The speech every character actor learns to dread. "Charles, you're a fine actor," casting director Milton Feldman had said, not even looking up from his notes. "Really solid work. But this is a leading man role. This needs someone audiences can root for, someone they can see themselves in, someone with leading man looks." Charles had sat quietly, absorbing the familiar rejection, the coded language that meant he was too ethnic, too weathered, too real for audiences who wanted fantasy over authenticity. "The truth is," Feldman continued, warming to his theme, "you'll never be leading man material. Your character actor stock. And there's nothing wrong with that. Plenty of successful careers built on supporting roles. But don't waste time chasing parts you were never meant to play." Now Charles sits in the commissary, turning that conversation over in his mind, wondering if Feldman might be right, wondering if 17 years of rejections might be the universe trying to tell him something about the limits of his ambitions. At the table across the room, Paul Newman finishes lunch with his agent, discussing his upcoming films. At 42 years old, Paul is everything Hollywood wants in a leading man. Blue eyes, perfect features, natural charisma that translates effortlessly to film. He's just finished Harper and Hombre, cementing his status as one of the most bankable stars in the business. Paul notices Charles sitting alone, recognizes the slumped shoulders and distant stare that come after particularly brutal casting sessions. He's seen that look on dozens of actors over the years, the look of someone questioning whether they belong in this business at all. Paul excuses himself from his agent, walks across the commissary to Charles' table. The conversation in the room doesn't stop, but the energy shifts. Paul Newman doesn't casually approach other actors unless something important is happening. "Mind if I sit?" Paul asks, already pulling out a chair. Charles looks up, surprised. He knows Paul by reputation, but they've never had more than passing conversations at industry events. Different levels of the Hollywood hierarchy. Different worlds entirely. "Of course," Charles says. "Though I'm not great company right now." Paul settles into his chair, studies Charles's expression with genuine concern. "Rough 17 years," Charles replies, attempting a smile that doesn't quite work. "Let me guess. Another casting director explained why you're not leading man material." Charles's surprise shows on his face. "How did you know?" "Because I was sitting 2 tables over when Feldman gave you his little speech about knowing your place in this industry." Charles feels his face flush with embarrassment. Bad enough to get rejected in private. Worse to have the rejection witnessed by Hollywood royalty. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," Charles says quietly. "I'm sorry you had to hear it," Paul responds. "Because Feldman is an idiot who wouldn't recognize leading man material if it bit him on the ass." The conversation in the commissary has definitely shifted now. Nearby tables lean in discreetly, trying to overhear what Paul Newman is saying to Charles Bronson. "Mr. Newman," Charles says, "I appreciate the sentiment, but maybe Feldman has a point. Maybe I've been chasing something that was never meant for me." Paul's expression hardens, not with anger, but with the intensity of someone who's about to deliver an important truth. "Charles, can I tell you something? Something that might surprise you." "Sure." Paul leans forward, lowers his voice so only Charles can hear. 5 years ago, I was sitting in this same commissary after getting rejected for a role I really wanted. Director told me I was too pretty, too clean, too obviously privileged to play working-class characters convincingly. Charles stares at him in disbelief. Paul Newman got rejected for being too handsome. Paul Newman got rejected for being wrong for the part. Just like you get rejected for being wrong for the part. But here's what I learned that day. And what you need to understand right now. Paul pauses, makes sure he has Charles' full attention. "We're not competing for the same roles, Charles. We never were. The parts I'm right for, you'd be wrong for. The parts you'd be perfect for, I'd look ridiculous in. But that doesn't make either of us less valuable." Charles processes this, seeing his career from a different angle for the first time in years. "You think Feldman would cast me as a romantic lead opposite Grace Kelly?" Paul continues. "Of course he would. You think he'd cast you as a coal miner whose family is being terrorized by corporate thugs? He'd be crazy not to. Different roles, different strengths, different kinds of leading men." Paul's voice rises slightly, enough for nearby tables to catch fragments of what he's saying. "The problem isn't that you're not leading man material," Paul says. "The problem is that Hollywood has a very narrow definition of what leading man material looks like. And that definition is about to change." "What do you mean?" Paul looks around the commissary, taking in the faces at other tables, the industry professionals who represent Hollywood's current thinking. "Audiences are changing, Charles. They're getting tired of pretty boys who look like they stepped out of magazine ads. They want authenticity. They want heroes who look like real people, who understand real struggle, who carry real weight in their faces and voices." Paul stands up, but continues talking, his voice now clearly audible to half the commissary. "You know what I see when I look at you? I see someone who's lived through things I can only pretend to understand. Someone who brings gravity and authenticity to every role because you've earned those qualities through experience." The commissary has gone noticeably quieter. Paul Newman is giving a speech about Charles Bronson, and everyone wants to hear what Hollywood's golden boy has to say about the industry's perpetual character actor. "I see someone who could carry a film about real working people better than any pretty boy actor in this town," Paul continues. "Someone who understands what it means to fight for everything you have because you've actually done it." Paul places his hand on Charles's shoulder, a gesture of support that everyone in the room can see. "Milton Feldman thinks leading men have to look like movie stars. But audiences are starting to figure out that real leading men look like real men, and you, my friend, are as real as they come." Charles stares up at Paul, processing words he's never heard from anyone in Hollywood's establishment. Words that reframe his entire career, his entire understanding of his place in the industry. "You really believe that?" Charles asks quietly. "I believe," Paul says, his voice carrying across the now silent commissary, "that in 5 years producers are going to be looking for actors who can carry films about real people facing real problems. And when that day comes, they're going to need someone who understands what real toughness looks like." Paul leans down, speaks quietly, but not so quietly that nearby tables can't hear. "They're going to need Charles Bronson. And you better be ready when they call." Paul straightens up, nods to Charles, and walks back to his own table, but the damage is done. Paul Newman just publicly endorsed Charles Bronson as leading man material in front of half of MGM's decision-makers. Within minutes, the story spreads through the studio. Paul Newman thinks Charles Bronson is undervalued. Paul Newman thinks Charles represents the future of leading men. Paul Newman just staked his reputation on defending an actor most people write off as character stock. 3 days later, Charles gets a call from his agent, There's interest from a European director named Sergio Leone, something about a Western where the lead character doesn't have to be conventionally handsome, where weathered authenticity matters more than magazine cover looks. 2 months later, Charles signs for Once Upon a Time in the West, playing a harmonica-wielding gunfighter seeking revenge. The role transforms him from character actor to international star. Proves that audiences were indeed ready for a different kind of leading man. Years later, when Charles is the highest-paid actor in the world, he tells interviewers about that afternoon in the MGM commissary. About Paul Newman's unexpected support at a moment when he was ready to give up on his dreams of carrying a film. "Paul saw something in me that I'd stopped seeing in myself," Charles would say. "He reminded me that there's more than one way to be a leading man. That authenticity can be more powerful than conventional good looks." Paul, for his part, takes no credit for Charles's success. "I just pointed out what was already there," he'd tell reporters. "Charles did the work. He earned every opportunity that came his way." But industry insiders know the truth. Paul Newman's public endorsement of Charles Bronson in that commissary changed how casting directors thought about leading men, opened doors that had been closed, created space for a different kind of hero. The moment that could have been about Hollywood hierarchy instead became about mutual respect between professionals, about recognizing talent even when it doesn't fit conventional molds, about using star power to lift others up instead of protecting your own position. Milton Feldman's narrow definition of leading man material got challenged that day, not by arguments or protests, but by Paul Newman's quiet confidence that audiences were ready for something real. Something that looked like Charles Bronson, and he was right. The audiences were ready. They were hungry for it. They just needed someone with Paul Newman's credibility to tell them it was okay to want heroes who looked like real people instead of movie stars. That's what shocked everyone in the commissary that day. Not conflict between two actors, but solidarity. Not competition, but collaboration. Paul Newman using his star power to expand what was possible for everyone else, and Charles Bronson learning that sometimes the people you least expect turn out to be exactly the allies you need.